Everyone. Great. So thank you all again for joining us for the Watershed Wednesdays webinar series. This evening's session, Understanding the Impact of Climate Change on Forests, Tools You Can Use, will be presented by Danielle Shannon of the Northern Forest Climate Hub. This presentation will last approximately 40 minutes, so there will be time for questions at the end. Please use the Q&A box to submit those questions to us. You can also drop any comments you'd like to into the chat box, but just make sure that that is set to send to everyone. So my name is Amanda Cabanillas, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Greene County Soil and Water Conservation District, or GCSWCD. This webinar series is being offered as part of 2023's Schoharie Watershed Month, which is a month-long series of free community events that celebrate and raise awareness of the waterways that flow across the Schoharie Reservoir watershed, as well as the 315 square miles of land that feed them. In addition to this evening's webinar, we also have one more next Wednesday. This had previously been scheduled for May 10th, but it is now on June 7th, and that will be What Could Stream Management Look Like in 50 Years, presented by Mark Vion. And then also coming up on June 11th, we will be joined for an interpretive walk through the Colgate Lake Wilderness area with author and ecologist Tom Wessels. Links for registering for both of those are in the chat now. All of the events that we are able to offer are made possible by the Schoharie Watershed Stream Management Program, which was established in the mid-1990s to protect drinking water quality through the preservation of natural stream system stability and ecological integrity. This is a partnership between Greene County Soil and Water Conservation District and the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. So again, this evening's session is Understanding the Impact of Climate Change on Forests, Tools You Can Use. It'll be presented by Danielle Shannon. Danielle is the coordinator of the Northern Forest Climate Hub and staff at Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and Michigan Technological University, where she helps land managers plan to adapt to the challenges of climate change. With a Master's of Science from the University of Minnesota in Forest Hydrology and Watershed Management, Danielle has collaborated with regional experts to develop adaptation strategies for forest managers focused on hydrology and the management of forested watersheds, non-forested wetland conservation and management, and Great Lakes ecosystems. So I will turn it over to you, Danielle.
Woohoo, thank you so much, Amanda. And it's so great to see all of you. And for anyone who's joining in and watching the webinar later, thank you for your engagement. Okay, so as it was stated, I'm here to talk to you about climate change and hopefully answer some questions or make some linkages for you on how you can integrate the thinking of climate change into the work that you do. And if that's in your woods or if that's in a broader forest management context. So just a little roadmap of where we're going to go. I'm going to kick it off with a little background on the work that I do that was sort of briefly referenced, and then go into maybe a little bit into the weeds on some climate change trends and how it affects forests, then move into, talking a little bit more about some of those tools that you can use and integrate, and cap it off with a nice case study. Okay, so in my bio, you heard the organization that I work with, the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub. And I'm guessing many of you don't really know about the USDA Climate Hub effort, but it's a really cool thing. And so I want you to know about it. It's an agency-wide, so the USDA is a department, so it's actually department-wide effort to bring climate change to the fold and to create resources that can be mainstreamed and be of use by soil and water conservation districts or woodland owners or agricultural farmers and consumers and ranchers. The whole idea is, can we take this big idea of climate change and help to make sense of it and deliver some practical tools and resources that people can actually use in their planning and their decision making? In your area, there's actually two climate hubs. There's the Northern Forest Climate Hub, mine, that focuses just on forests. And then there's an agricultural climate hub. That's the Northeast Climate Hub. So you have a lot of resources and a lot of technical expertise right at your fingers. I also am staff at this really awesome organization called the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And what that is, it's a multi-institutional collaboration between lots of different partners to come to the table to think about how can we develop products and foster that communication and science delivery technology for professional natural resource managers, but outside, within and outside of the topics of just management. So how can we think about conservation and management? How can we think about forest industry? How can we think about climate change in forests from a tribal perspective and provide those resources and that added capacity to organizations that are needing that? So we're, just sort of a big umbrella organization to help motivate others to really think about this topic deeply. Okay, so the work that I do really does center on forests. It centers on forests from lots of different perspectives, but it's really focused on how that critical and crucial role of forests on the landscape and especially in the watershed. So, from your interest in the soil and water conservation district, I'm sure that you have a full understanding of what a healthy watershed is. I should have just made a pop quiz and had people fill out the answers because I'm sure all of you are well schooled in the valuable and integral part that forests play in our lives, from regulating stream flow, creating clean air, reducing erosion, creating clean water supplies. We know lots of people benefit from that in the Catskill region, and also, sequestering carbon, creating wildlife habitat, creating recreational opportunities, and just being a central place, a cultural respite for so many of us. But with the realities of the world and how things are changing, we understand that forests are changing because of this, global warming, because of climate change. As the climate is changing, this is really introducing, a huge magnitude of uncertainty around what our future forest, what the future of forests are, and what those conditions might be over time, and how that fundamental ecosystem processes that's controlled by forests could be changed or altered due to a forest becoming maybe unhealthy or just changing over time. Forests, like I said, are changing and will continue to change in response to rapid climate change. As their tree habitats shift, that will have an effect on our watershed hydrologic processes, and that really could challenge our traditional expectations of what forests are and what we can expect from them, the amount of water, quality, and yield that we could receive year after year. So, with all of that in mind, it's just to say that there's a lot of uncertainty around this topic, and I need to acknowledge that there really is no one size fits all to understanding the future of how we're going to face this challenge, especially in the context of watershed ecosystem management. Every place in the landscape has a completely different set of tools and emphasis on, the forests to help that forest cope with these vulnerabilities. So, on the topic of vulnerability, this will really be the focus of my talk. It's really talking about, how are forests vulnerable to climate change, how are watersheds, maybe how they might be able to cope with or even change with changes over time. And yeah, and so vulnerability is the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with those adverse changes of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. So when we're talking about vulnerability, what we're really looking at is to what degree our forests, maybe those particular species or even areas within our watershed are less able to cope with those stresses and changes of climate change over time. You might be saying, well, why do we want to assess vulnerability? We know that everything is affected by climate change. And although that is true, by evaluating and assessing, how much, what that threshold of change is that could still maintain a healthy forest, it's really helping us understand, not only where we want to do the work that we're doing in conservation and management, it can, by having an understanding of where and what in the watershed is vulnerable, it can help us really set up those long-term strategies, those adaptation strategies over time, and give us a good understanding of what communities are most affected by those changes. It might be certain communities that you wouldn't even have thought about if you hadn't already assessed that vulnerability across the landscape. And by having a good understanding of climate change vulnerability and risk, it can help you go for bigger pots of money and funding resources that I know the Soil and Water Conservation District is probably very good at for restoration and education projects. Okay, and so what I'm going to show you today is when we're talking about vulnerability, there's lots of different ways to understand this problem. And so I'm going to put forth, many different tools that we have created, tools and resources that are right at your fingertips, and you can go and check out at forestadaptation.org. What we do is really create tools that can help to connect the dots between the vulnerability of trees and ecosystems to those real world climate adaptation responses that we can take that can be integrated into our on the ground actions that can help ecosystems overcome those challenges over time. So I'll talk about vulnerability, some readings that you can do, some interactive places that you can check out all of this information. So we'll be going through this, but I just want to put that out there that there is a place for you to go and find all these resources afterwards. Okay, so let's get into this. How will climate change affect forests and ecosystems? We know that climate change has and will continue to alter forest ecosystems. And we know that climate change will have an effect on all lands, but not all lands will be affected in the same way, meaning some forest ecosystems, plants, and tree species may be less vulnerable to the threats of climate change. So sometimes we get wrapped up in this idea of like climate change is going to have a blanket effect on everything and everything will respond in the same way. And we usually go right to doom, right? But that's not necessarily the case. So I just want to instill that in your brain that climate change will have an effect on all lands, but not all lands will be affected or will respond in the same way. That's due to many different facets of the topography, that buffering concept of how temperature is, where it's sitting on the landscape, and the species that are resident on the landscape. So when we're talking about climate change, what we're really talking about is this rate of greenhouse gas emission that's being released into the atmosphere and in our understanding of how that might play out in the future. So the black line here is really our observed history, what we understand in this most recent history of global surface temperature change. And then these different colored lines are these model projections. And the models are trained on past observations, but they really do help us tell that story of what might be given different concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions over time. Each line represents that possible pathway, different things that we could do globally that might change that temperature over time. But really, these are just assumptions based on what we understand from not only greenhouse gas emission, but also social behavior and policy. So there's a lot wrapped up in this. For our discussion today, I will reference at times a low scenario or a high scenario. The low scenario is this RCP 4.5, and the high scenario is this red line, which is considered our business as usual, do nothing, no change line. And you can see, unfortunately, we're sort of on that pathway, but hopefully we will get to a point in our globe where we can deviate off. So I'm going to represent change in this bookend approach that gives us that understanding of some plausible futures. So here we are. When we're looking at climate trends and the data that I'm showing here, this is really describing a plausible future by the end of century. So that's 2099. So I'm showing here some data that's for the Catskill regions. And keep in mind, these are average values and that locations within the region may vary substantially based on latitude, elevation, land use, or other factors that could, increase or decrease your exposure to warmth. So it's notable here that the temperature increases are much higher in the high scenario, which is consistent with just about every other region that we've looked at. Precipitation is always a little bit more difficult to model, but what we see here is a trend of a small increase, kind of a moderate increase over time in both scenarios. And during the growing season, we're seeing that the slightest of increases in precipitation, which importantly is the time when you need water. So that could have some really serious implications for our vegetation and our forests. Another point to consider with the change that I'm showing here is that with the large changes in temperature under the high scenario, the increase in precipitation just might not be enough to offset that moisture that's lost to evaporation and evapotranspiration. So you'll see some of these scenarios again, but it's showing some substantial change. Again, by 2099, that's in the future, but this is the deviation from 2009. So anywhere between 6.7 degrees in the low scenario to 11 degrees warming. That's a huge shift. Now, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to climate models and it comes to the residential concentration pathways, those RCPs. And I just don't have enough time to go into all that, but I want to empower all of you to read more about it. There's some really amazing resources that were written for anyone to understand. So you don't have to be a climate scientist to pick these up and get a good understanding. I would say if you just want a broad narrative, check out the fourth National Climate Assessment or our forested ecosystem assessment. But if you want to dig into the data and the trends, check out this climate science special report. And stay tuned because later this year, they're going to be releasing the fifth National Climate Assessment. So some really awesome reading right there at your fingertips. Okay, so we know that again, climate change is having an effect on the condition and quality of our forested watersheds. I mean, it's not just the forests, it's the watersheds. They really are integrated. So when we're thinking about the changes that are happening, we know that they're happening in lots of different places in our watershed. So forests already facing these threats, and that changing climate is only intensifying those existing challenges that we're already facing and altering that condition and quality of the ecosystems, the wildlife habitats, the water quality, the water quantity, and infrastructure in just so many different ways. I just want to point that out. Sometimes it's easy to get pigeonholed into thinking about one particular thing in the landscape, like grouse habitat or something, but we're really talking about just expansive, interconnected change across our watersheds. But first, let's start talking a little bit just, singularly, and then we'll get back to the watershed perspective. One way to begin thinking about our lands is to think about ecosystem plant composition and how that might change. So first, climate change will alter that composition of our forests over time. As that climate warms, many of those northern species common to our forests just might be unable to cope with these changes and may not be able to persist at that southern edge of their range and want to push further north. At the same time, we're having species that are at the northern part of their range, those southerly species that are no longer adapted to that warmer growing season and are seeking, more hospitable habitat for themselves. And so they're seeking even new habitat. So at the Catskills in particular, you're at that zone of probably that connection point where you're getting those species that are more temperate that are seeking the northern part of their range. If we look at the data behind this, that was a conceptual drawing, a really conceptual idea, but it's a pretty common framework. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this idea of species seeking, edges of more northern areas in their habitat range. But we can support this with data as well. So if we were to dig into this a bit more, I want to introduce you to this idea of some habitat modeling that is done in the USDA Forest Service. It is a series of models that do project and describe not only existing tree habitat, but they integrate climate change data into their habitat models to better understand how tree species habitat may shift on the landscape due to that, climate-induced warmer temperature and precipitation patterns. This data set and this tool is called the USDA Forest Service Tree Atlas tool. They're a group that we work with very commonly. So the idea is to take the data that we have on forests and then to present different futures of, what would that forest look like under a low emissions, less warming scenario? And what would that forest look like under the very warm scenario? We need models like this because we just don't have a crystal ball, right? We can't tell the future, and we can conceptually understand how things might change, but it is helpful to have that visual. Shown here, we're looking at suitable habitat growing conditions by end of century for black cherry. So on the left, you can see, where those important areas are. They're in blue, coated in blue and in green. So this is what we understand of its present day distribution. And then on the right, you can see these different climate scenarios. It's kind of hard to point this out, but you can see that the dark blue areas do change or just go away in that much warmer future, that higher emissions climate scenario. When we look at your area and the Catskills, we can get a better picture for the common species to your county using that, again, that low to high emission scenario, end of century perspective. And we can see that there's quite a few species that are common to Greene County that are actually in the poor capability zone. And when we talk about capability, we're really talking about this idea of not only can trees, is their habitat going to shift? Are they going to be, in an area that's still within their known habitat range? Is the tree able to adapt to those changes? Does it have the biology and the physical qualities to overcome some of those stresses of climate change? And we call this the capability. So this is the capability of trees in your county. And I'm showing you from the poor capability, fair capability, good capability, and new habitat migration potential. So I want to point out here that what I'm showing you is not a picture of death, right? Like you're not going to go out into your woods and say goodbye, balsam fir. But what I'm showing you is that these are maybe some of the trees in our ecosystem that we need to keep a good eye on, right? We need to make sure that they might be situated into places that are more persistently cooler. They might be, maybe we're not planting them in more exposed areas and ridge lines, and we're protecting the populations that we have, right? This is where we want to really double down and just protect what we have. When we're thinking about planting projects and restorations, maybe we'll look beyond that traditional set of trees that we would normally go for and start imagine, how can we enhance the habitat for species that are already present on our landscape. Maybe you already have black oak or white oak, and this is a species that might be more tolerable to those extreme changes over time. So there's a lot to unpack right here. Again, I don't have a lot of time to go into every tree, but I think you should download this data and check it out yourself and print it. What I was showing you is drawn directly from this handout that we've created, which we've taken the data from the Climate Change Tree Atlas, and we've made it in a more user-friendly format. And you can download it at forestadaptation.org/Mid-Atlantic. Here you're going to find all of the definitions for all of those variables that help to create that defining characteristic of capability. And if you wanted to unpack it even further, you could go to the Climate Change Tree Atlas website and download the data yourself. So all of this is very transparent and open, but we just want to get it into your hands. So definitely check it out when you're thinking about a tree that you want to plant or a riparian restoration project. Take a glance at this list first. Okay, so we talked about trees in particular. We talked about range shifts. We talked about their own internal biological abilities to persist in the landscape and to cope with some of these changes. Some trees just are unable to cope with extreme heat or drought, long periods of drought. So having a good understanding of that can give us a leg up when we're thinking about how a tree will respond to climate change effects over time. It can be a little bit more complex when we're thinking about watersheds, right? They're huge areas. There's so much involved. And so I'm going to walk you through some conceptual ideas of how we can, connect the dots between what we know as trees to a forested watershed. Well, first, there's this idea that trees are part of a really unique system. The projected climate vulnerability of the tree doesn't necessarily indicate how it might be how it might be affected by watershed change over time. So there's other factors at play that can increase the effects of climate change locally. And so that's where we're getting into this watershed idea, that watersheds are not static. Changes to one component of the ecosystem can have a huge effect on the ecosystem writ large. So from a watershed context, we know that, changes to one species, especially a keystone species like hemlock, can have a real cumulative effect that may affect another component of the ecosystem. So take, for instance, hemlock, as I'm showing here, that is already affected by hemlock woolly adelgid in much of the United States. I'm not sure if you're really battling it where you're at, but this is what it looks like. With climate change, we're seeing huge range expansion of pests, especially hemlock woolly adelgid, and it's just creating a more hospitable condition for that pest that's moving more north in its range and at a much faster rate than we would expect. So yeah, one tree is affected by hemlock woolly adelgid. Okay, well, we can deal with that. But in some watersheds, it can really take off, and we might not have the capacity to go out there and to take trees down and, abate that problem, or even spray the tree or do any type of treatment. It just might be out of our hands. So, with the loss of one tree can come many, and the loss of a keystone riparian species can have just a huge downstream consequence on shade, you know, losing shade, creating that warmer waters, greater exposure to sunlight, and that can just have, a huge impact on not only the riparian trees that are still standing, but it can have a huge impact on downstream flood control and soil retention and nutrient uptake and ultimately clean water that is expected from our forested watersheds. So when we're thinking about trees and we have to scale it to that watershed perspective, we do need to bring in many of these other indirect pieces to help us understand how that watershed might cope with that change and what that might mean for our downstream communities. Another way to visualize this is, when we're talking about watersheds, we're especially talking about riparian forests that are located in the headwaters. We do know that riparian forests located in headwaters are just a huge control on on how fast that runoff and that rainflow will move downslope and downstream, right? If we have really intact the headwater streams, we basically have a great sponge. Once we lose that, we can have a huge effect downstream. So if we have this intact watershed, um, what is the impact of that of on a watershed if a key riparian species is lost, especially in that headwaters area? That can mean loss of water storage. It can be more energy flows downstream. It can, again, translate into a huge loss of flood protection and regulation of stream flow. And unfortunately, over time, can lead to huge degradation of our streams, making unstable conditions and reshaping them so that they're no longer acting the way that we would hope that they would act, and it would create a new balance when it comes to sediment transfer over time. Everything becomes deeper and deeper. So again, when we're talking about watersheds, we're talking about climate change impacts that are cumulative. So when we think about these changes and how they're occurring, again, get that interconnected linkage, that cumulative effect of climate change on watersheds is really just like water. It is flowing downstream. So drawing from our example, if we've lost that effective riparian buffering, maybe now, if we've lost that riparian buffering, even a small rain event can intensify those flows downstream, and in some cases may lead to a catastrophic damage that could affect infrastructure that's not designed to cope with those increased peak flows, and may mean loss of access for a community that really needs that one road, right? So this is a really linear example of how a riparian area up in the headwaters can have a downstream effect. And, but it's not always the case, right? Usually we're reacting to the problem. So for those who are from the Soil and Water Conservation District, it might be easy to think about, non-point source pollution and how to uncover those stresses over time. But climate change is really that invisible hand that's just intensifying these changes and accelerating the rate of change over time. It truly is a threat multiplier. It's not just a change that's affecting one tree because of one extreme event, like a flood or extreme wind event. It's that cumulative effect over time, year after year, or even month after month, that is adding these additional stresses to these ecosystems. And sure, they can bounce back, but there's going to be a time when those stresses are really just becoming, much too hard for that tree or forested system to persist over time, and you get into this chronic spiral. So, are we totally doomed? Well, not necessarily. Again, not all sites will respond in the same way to the threats of climate change. And so we can't broadly assume an outcome that will happen, because of climate change. It really does depend on the site conditions and the adaptive capacity of that system to cope with those changes over time. Every place matters. The system, the hydrologic sensitivity, what's living there, what is, how's that vegetation tolerant to disturbance over time? What are those previous land uses that are causing current day stresses? And what might is a new land use that really could influence how water is moving through the landscape? So we're really just wanting to put a fine point on it that there really is no blanket one size fits all consequence to climate change. It really is this interconnected, it will have an interconnected effect on the entire watershed. Okay, so we're going to pull ourselves out of the doom spiral and start thinking about actions that we can take and ways that we can respond to this problem. I mean, you're all here because you're really curious about it. So I'm hoping I can empower you to feel like you can make some changes that will help to help that system adapt to changes over time. So, what is adaptation? Adaptation are the actions that we can take to help help a system adjust to or in preparation for a climate change impact over time. What these ideas are is adaptation actions are really targeted. They're designed to specifically address impacts and vulnerabilities and risks over time in order to meet our goals and our objectives. If we need to have a road and we need to have access, then our goal is to maintain access and our objectives are to keep that culvert open. We're really thinking about with climate change adaptation, actions that we can take that will build on that good sustainable management, conservation, and restoration ideology that we're constantly trying to put out there, right? So we're still doing riparian restorations, but maybe we're thinking about it from that climate change lens as well. One important idea that I do want to put out here is, in the end, the actions that we are taking when we're thinking about climate change are really anchored in our own values and our willingness to accept those risks and our tolerance for changes over time. So not everyone is necessarily in the same boat when it comes to their threshold of risk. It really is rooted in our actions and how we prioritize moving forward is really rooted in, what do you care? Why do you care about this landscape? What do you value? And how much risk are you willing to tolerate before it might change on its own over time? What are our options? I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but there's lots of resources on our website. I wanted to show you sort of from that professional perspective when we're doing education and outreach with natural resources professionals. We're talking about this suite of options. There really is not again, a one size fits all roadmap for how to adapt to climate change over time. We're talking about a whole continuum of adaptation actions from reducing impacts, taking actions that can reduce impacts but will basically maintain current conditions. You're imagining like keeping that ecosystem in a firm bubble, all the way to taking actions that help to facilitate change, and more forward looking actions that will help to promote change. By no means do I want you to think that people are doing, only one of these three categories. Oftentimes, when we're thinking about how we'll respond to a climate change threat, we're thinking about it in a triage approach. We're looking at the greatest risk first, and then, maybe waiting and seeing. Maybe we're doing a little bit now, and then we have some plan Bs and plan Cs lined up. So it's okay to strategize your approach when you're thinking about climate change, especially if you have something that is incredibly important, like a rare rare species. And so maybe resistance is what you need to do right now. It's to dig in, it's really to keep that rare species on the landscape. But there may come a time when the landscape becomes too brittle and is no longer able to function in the way that it should. And you might have to start thinking about other options. There are some places on the landscape that are already in pretty poor condition. And so if we're thinking about restoring, we can think about a transitional idea that will help to restore the ecosystem function while still aligning it with those future climate trajectories. So there's lots of ways to think about this puzzle. While there are, many approaches when it comes to supporting forests and adapting to climate change, it's going to look really different based on what kind of forest type and landscape you're in. And so I'm going to show you some fundamental strategies that we do talk about when we talk about climate adaptation. By generally avoiding forest loss and fragmentation, reducing stressors, and supporting ecosystem function, we can support, the natural ecosystem adaptive capacity to cope with those climate changes over time. And in some cases, a more passive approach might be appropriate, whereas in other cases, a more active management intervention may be necessary in order to correct course and get that system back on. So if you want to learn more about these tenets and big ideas related to adapting to forest to climate change, I would say check out these resources created by some really smart folks in the Northeast, located at masswoods.org. And you can find resources on forest carbon and forest resiliency. Really great reading. But what you're going to find here is that for those who've been thinking about forests for a long time, these 4 ideas are pretty common ideas, right? It's just reframing and contextualizing them in the context of vulnerability and risk for places on the landscape that we care about. How do we reduce stressors? What can we do precisely for your place that will help to proactively reduce stress? Or how can we diversify stand species, age, and structure? That might look different on your property versus your neighbors. So again, important to think about, these actions as being customized approaches. Okay, so now let's round the corner and start to look at some of the tools that you can use to inform your decisions. At this point, you're, probably asking yourself, well, what can I do? Can we take actions that can help our ecosystems prepare for these stresses and strains brought about by climate change? What are the tools and strategies that are available to help assist me with this thinking? And before I get there again, I'm going to remind you that if you want a single answer for how to respond to climate changes, it depends. It really does depend on where you are and where you're working, what perspective you're working from, and what you're trying to achieve. So, cat's out of the bag that there's lots of different approaches to adapting to climate change, and it really does depend where you're coming from and what your end goal is as far as what tools you might use to help solve that problem. But one tool that I do think is really helpful is really studying those tree species projections. I brought it up very briefly, how the climate projections work when we're talking about habitat changes, and I showed you that handout of that synthesis of the data for, is appropriate for your area. When you're thinking about the work that you're already doing, you can apply that data to that work. So we were talking about stream restoration as the upcoming webinar. Maybe you include these tree species projections into that thinking. What are those trees that you're already using? Evaluate their habitat suitability. If you have a list, a typical tree inventory that you always draw from, go look at the climate data and evaluate, well, how much warming can that species or that stock take on in order to regenerate, especially in the growing years. Tree species projections are especially useful when, we're looking at that overall vulnerability of our forests, when we're trying to visualize where the low, moderate, high vulnerability tree species might be in our plot. This is a really interesting idea of looking at your woods and even visually marking them and saying, well, this is a low vulnerability species or this is a high vulnerability species. And that can give us a better understanding of where we should be, again, really focusing our efforts to make sure some of those plants are watered, or just looking at that tree change, health change over time. We can use these lists to inform our riparian area management and the long-term planning efforts. And again, lastly, they can be integrated into planting lists. Maybe the Soil Water Conservation District has starts presenting some tree species that are more climate adapted. So definitely take a look at those. Imagine where you're going to plant them. Imagine how high the water might get and if those trees can handle wet feet. Really start thinking about the trees in your woods from that context of extremes, and start imagining where some risks might bubble up over time. But again, all of this is information that requires a lot of site level expertise and judgment when you're interpreting those results. So make sure you're talking about it with other people. If you are a person who wants to integrate climate change into a professional land management plan or even a custom, silvicultural prescription, I would say definitely check out some of the planning tools that we have in our organization. We have a 5-step adaptive management decision support tool that helps you intentionally consider climate change in planning and really supports you in customizing your own climate adaptation actions that will work for your location. It's really just a set of worksheets that help to guide a practitioner through that thought process of, what are those greatest climate change risks for my place, and how could I, create actions that would help to overcome those risks over time. Nothing that we do ever, is a recommended. We don't make recommendations. Everything we do is trying to center on manager expertise and judgment. So you can find our the quick guide, which is a 4-page worksheet, or a much longer version at our website, forestadaptation.org/adaptation workbook. If you're interested in using this tool, we do offer several trainings throughout the year, in particular an 8-week-long online virtual training, where each week we walk through each step of the adaptation workbook and help to be your coaches, your climate change phone a friend. The Adaptation Workbook, the tool that we've created, is designed to help a person create a customized climate adaptation plan. And the idea is that you walk through each component of the planning process, but with the perspective of climate change. So you're thinking about your place and what it is that you're trying to do there. Then you bring in that climate change data. Then you evaluate if you can even do what you set out to do. Looking at your goals and objectives through a really harsh lens. And then you start to imagine, what are those real world actions I can take to help overcome those climate change risks over time. And then we coach you through thinking about and setting up a monitoring plan to help you evaluate the effectiveness of your actions over time. Again, you can check it out online. We would really love to work with you if you are interested in creating an adaptation plan. All right, so in my last few minutes, I want to walk through our adaptation case study. This project is located pretty far north from you, but it's a really cool project. This project was led by several members of the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, who manage about 7,000 acres, 6,800 acres of forest land. And the goals of their project was really to initiate some stand regeneration, restore that native plant community, including those desired understory plants, and to just really enhance the quality of forest products on the site as well. The team wanted to think about the vulnerability of their place, and they used the Climate Change Tree Atlas information to evaluate their lowland forest wetland management area. And from their understanding of the forest and the change that they were observing, in addition to that climate change data that they were reviewing, they were finding that the suitable habitat for black ash would be substantially reduced due to climate change in their location, and also due to the presence of emerald ash borer, which is a pest that I'm sure many of you are aware of, a pest that's not slowing down because of colder winters, but it's definitely accelerating its range due to much warmer winters. And so this is a problem that they are seeing as not only pest range changing, but also the habitat suitability of some of these more northern cold hardy species changing over time as well. So given the climate change of the forest that's expected to see shorter, milder winters and increased precipitation, they wanted to see what they could do, so more precipitation, a forest that is kind of struggling with warmer temperatures over time, and invasive species that could outcompete some of their native species as well. So responding to this directly to climate change vulnerabilities and risks, they decided to find ways to improve the ability of the forest to resist pests and pathogens, and really sought out ideas that could help be opportunities for them for their forest to recover after disturbances. So using the results of the tree atlas, they were able to triage their approach to guide the forest to become more resilient, really seeking out ways to maintain or improve the ability of their forests to resist pests and pathogens over time. Specific actions, using forest thinning to reduce the ash component, really focusing on guiding that forest to regenerate northern white cedar, improving grouse habitat, favoring high quality future adapted trees that were already present on site, making sure that they were in a position to grow in a really healthy way. And they upped their monitoring for buckthorn and other invasive species, as they were now expecting to see more of that than they were before. So you can go and check out this project at forestadaptation.org/SRM-ASH. And truthfully, there's so many projects that you could read about. We have worked with well over 600 different organizations in different project areas to think about climate change in a very real world context using the Adaptation Workbook and using the resources that I showed earlier. And you can go to our website and you can click on any of these dots to learn more about them. There's probably only a subset of the total groups that we've worked with online, and that's just due to their own choice for anonymity or other organizational constraints. But we really invite you to come and learn from this community of land managers and other organizations that are taking this really seriously and taking action now to intentionally respond to climate change in their forest and ecosystem planning. These are really great stories to help you conceptualize what it looks like in a particular place. You can read about their goals, you can read about their climate related challenges, and then see that logical connection between their goal, the climate change vulnerabilities, and their actions. You can see all of that laid out on the page. So definitely go and check that out. And lastly, what is it that you can do? Well, you can read. It's super important for you to pick up some of these resources and just, wrestle with it, really read it, understand the climate science, understand what the implications are for our forested ecosystems. You can pick up our vulnerability assessments to see not only observed climate change data, but understand that future climate projection data. We do examine a range of future climates and conditions and then bring it all back to what it means to that ecosystem and possible ecosystem vulnerabilities. And in the very end, we also link it to the potential implications for forest management. Again, none of our resources make recommendations. We're really just synthesizing best available science for you. And in the state of New York, we're kind of splitting the region. So there's an ecoregion that's more northern Northwoods, that's the Adirondacks, and that's included in the New England Vulnerability Assessment. And then the rest of New York is included in this Mid-Atlantic assessment. And, you know, our assessments are quite long. So I would totally understand if you did not want to pick one up. And if you're more of like a story map kind of person, I would invite you to come and check out these interactive ways to read and see some of the data that's embedded in our vulnerability assessments. So you can go and learn all about the Mid-Atlantic forest shown here and click on any of the tabs above to get a snippet of some of the information that's in the report. For those of you who are actually doing work on the ground and want to integrate climate change into your work and are familiar working with NRCS, I would say check out some of the resources we have that help to create that linkage between, you know, NRCS programs and their financial assistance to climate adaptation actions. We've created quite a few brochures that help to show how you can use existing programs to help answer that problem of how you can respond to climate change. So for those who are not aware, NRCS really provides some substantial financial assistance for those who are interested in engaging in their conservation and management programs. So, you know, we just want to make sure that everyone's aware that this really is a whole USDA, one USDA mission to help integrate these concepts into all that we do. Okay, so lastly here, what can you do? Again, diagnose vulnerabilities, really review that climate change vulnerability, those resources, and evaluate them at your site. Go walk around your woods and get a better sense of how water moves in more extreme circumstances or in drought circumstances. Start to look at, you know, how trees are positioned on the landscape and start to figure out what the trees are, and then you can better understand their habitat suitability and capability. When it comes to planning, think about your place and your objectives within that context of risk and values. We're not going to be able to do work in every corner of every watershed, so we need to be really strategic in making some of our choices. And so with that, we might have to consider a triage approach. When you're coming up with these ideas, make a plan, document your considerations, and be really transparent, because what you're doing now might not make sense to anyone else in the future, right? Like, you're not going to be around forever. So write down your ideas, write down your assumptions, and make sure that the next person in line has access to that so they really truly understand what it is that you're trying to do. But lastly, intentionally take actions to respond to climate change. Now's the time. We can't wait. So please go out and do good things. And with that, thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact myself, Danielle Shannon, or my colleague, Patricia Leopold.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you for ending on that note. Please go out and do good things. That was so good. We haven't had any questions come through, but we do have a few minutes left. So if anyone wanted to drop a question in either the Q&A box or the chat box, just make sure that that's set to go to everyone. So we'll wait another minute, see if anything comes through. But
I'm always available and willing to answer questions or
excellent.
point you in the right direction.
Yeah, I'll be sending the link out to the recording to everyone who is registered, and I'll include some of the great links that you had posted in your slides and your email address as well.
Awesome.
Great.
Well, I will send you a PDF of the presentation as well.
Oh, wonderful. All right, seeing no questions come through, I think we can wrap it up. So thank you so much, Danielle. This was really wonderful. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Take care.
Yeah, have a great one. Bye, everyone.
Take care.